Hello everyone. I feel a bit weird. I've never spoken wearing this thing before. This is very tough for me. I have never given a speech of this kind in 15 minutes. It normally takes me an hour, so I'll be tested today. So I don't have time to talk too much about politics or about history. And it's important actually to talk about them because they provide some background, some context to my story and to my work. And my work is, I try to be a professional in my work, but it is at the same time very personal. So I will begin this talk with the year of my birth and the place of my birth. So I was born in former Yugoslavia, the country which no longer exists. I was born in Bosnia, which was part of former Yugoslavia. So I was born in a village called Kevljani, and the village was based where you can see that orange spot, orange dot. So I was born in a Muslim community. So my village was a Muslim village, and this is my little Muslim family. This is what Bosnian Muslims looked like, just an ordinary family. So this picture is very dear to me, but there is a long story behind it. I have no time to tell you the whole story. The picture was taken when I was 6 months old, so you can guess I'm the baby in the picture. So for the first 7 years, I didn't go to school. That was the law in former Yugoslavia. So I'm very pleased that I didn't go to school because that was the only carefree time in my life. So I spent my time roaming around the fields in the village. And also when I was old enough, before I started my school, one of the things I was doing was herding cows in the village. So I have some lovely memories of some really nice cows from my childhood. So at the age of 7, I started my school in my village. And this picture was taken 8 years later when I was in my 8th grade. And when you look at these kids, you can't make any difference between ourselves. And it's a mixture of Muslims and Serbs. So we were just kids. And I would say that for most of us, our identity was a Yugoslav identity. The guy whose portrait is hanging above our heads tried to create. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed. So after I completed my primary and secondary education, I continued my education in my town, Prijedor, and some of my new classmates were Croats, Roman Catholics. So I didn't actually talk or think about my upbringing in these terms, using all these different labels. And I remember when I was in my 3rd or 4th year in high school, our history teacher, I still remember his name, Aleksandar Bojko. So this was the time when some serious trouble started taking place. He asked us to identify by our nationality, and most of us put our heads down because we felt ashamed, because most of us felt we were Yugoslavs. But I would say that, so I was 18, 1986, when Slobodan Milošević came to power. And I think that was the beginning of the end of my former country, former Yugoslavia. And I also say, I didn't know it at the time, that Slobodan Milošević marked the end of innocence for myself and for my whole generation. I couldn't possibly dream that a couple of years, several years down the line, Milošević would start a series of devastating wars, which would claim 140,000 lives. So he was not a unifier. He came to power and he couldn't reform the country. I think he was only interested in power. And in order for people like himself to stay in power, he had to divide the country. Remember, at the time when he came to power, if somebody asked us to identify by our nationality, we would put our heads down. So in history is full of examples or cases like Slobodan Milošević. So he was dividing in order to rule. So he was prepared, if he was prepared to get rid of his personal mentor, and he got him killed some years later, then what could people like myself expect from an individual like Slobodan Milošević? So the situation developed over a number of years. Some people say, how come things turned ugly so quickly overnight? And I said it took a long, long time. Very powerful propaganda, but unfortunately, again, I haven't got much time to talk about that. So because of his politics, some parts of former Yugoslavia eventually decided to become independent, to declare independence, Slovenia and Croatia. So this is 1991. And because the army sided with Milošević, so I did my national service in 1988, 1989. And before the first war in Slovenia, I thought actually the army should step in, stage a coup. It sounds absolutely horrible, because I thought it was the last remaining unifying force. Little did I know that the same army would try to kill me. So the war in Slovenia was very brief, but when it moved to Croatia, it was much closer to my home. About 5,000 of my Serb neighbors went to fight in Croatia, just across the border. And sometimes we could hear the sound of shelling in Croatia. And many developments were taking place in my community of Prijedor. So in April of 1992, a local branch of Serbian Democratic Party staged a very successful coup. And even then, I didn't believe that the threats that they were issuing to people like myself, if we didn't go to fight in Croatia, that we would be attacked by them. And at this point in time, I had long hair then as well. I had a little bit more hair here than I do now, but my mother said, and my middle brother, get a haircut and get out of here. It was still possible to leave the region, to escape from the region. But I very naively thought, well, we can't just all get up and leave. We've lived here for hundreds of years. So my mother was warning me because she had a hunch what was going to happen. She survived the Second World War. And my family suffered as a result of the Second World War. Her father was executed in 1946 because of the Second World War. Another long story. And my eldest uncle, my father's eldest brother, was killed at Bleiburg. Some of you would have heard about Bleiburg. That's another long story. He was not a war criminal. He was just executed because he happened to be there. So my mother knew that what was coming couldn't be good at all. But I stayed behind because I was naive. I didn't have her experience. And when my village was finally attacked, I couldn't leave the region anymore. So then unimaginable became possible. So this was a very ugly war. I say it was a war against civilian population, and no one was spared. So I'll give you a very brief story behind this shirt. So this boy, he was only 2. His name was Namir, and it's fascinating that in former Yugoslavia, so many Christian and Muslim names have this word, peace, as part of their name. So Namir was one of them. And so when the Serbs took control of my town, his grandfather collaborated with the new Serb authorities. And then Namir and his grandfather were taken to this Serb house, which they were told, or which his grandfather was told was a safe house. So several days later, a group of Serb soldiers arrived at the house, and they shot Namir and his grandfather dead. So I tried to count the number of bullet holes on this shirt. There were just too many. So this boy didn't understand the world around him. He didn't understand politics, but not even 101 other children like himself were spared in the spring and the summer of 1992 in Prijedor. So I was luckier than Namir. I was lucky enough to end up in a concentration camp. So I'll repeat that. I was lucky enough to end up in a concentration camp. It was a better fate than his fate. So then I had to survive in this place called Omarska, a concentration camp which was set up on the outskirts of the village where the school photo was taken. And I'll just quickly take you back to that picture. So you see the guy in front with his legs crossed, clenching his left fist. Milojica, he's one of my former schoolmates. So when I ended up in the Omarska camp, I recognized a lot of the guards. So you see the guy to your left holding a rifle. So that's Milojica, that's my former schoolmate. So life in the camp was horrible. In the first 2 weeks, there was almost no food at all. Later, we were given 1 meal a day, and it was not proper food, some lukewarm soup. So after nearly 2.5 months, I lost about 1/3 of my body weight. When we were brought inside the camp, there wasn't enough space to sit on the floor. After the first 2 weeks, the process, let's call it, of interrogation started. People were called out, taken out, interrogated, tortured, killed. So at one point, one of the guards came inside my room and called my brother out. I was in the Omarska camp together with my middle brother. And somebody reported that he had a rifle. So normally when somebody like Qasim was taken out, they didn't come back. And I felt I was the loneliest person in the world at that point in time. I never felt that lonely before or since. My brother was lucky. He was tortured. He was interrogated by this man. He didn't know who he was. He was tortured, but he stayed alive. And he came back. And soon after this, the camp authorities brought a lot of new people to the camp. And that's probably what saved my brother's life. So the focus of the camp authorities shifted to these new people. They started killing people for the first time from guns. So sometimes it's hard for me to think that I cannot claim this with certainty, that some people had to die for my brother to live. So I tried to delay myself being interrogated for as long as possible. In the end, I had to go to be interrogated myself, and I ended up in the same room where my brother was interrogated. And my brother didn't know who this man was, but as soon as I entered the room, I recognized this guy straight away. I never expected to see him in the Omarska camp. He was possibly one of my most favorite teachers. And so very quickly he realized that I was one of his former students, but he failed to acknowledge me. He failed to acknowledge my humanity. And I could see that actually he enjoyed what he was doing. And he was basically determining who was to live, who was to die. So we will never know how many people he sent to their deaths. I was lucky to survive. So towards the end of my stay in this camp, suddenly the guards, those brutes who were torturing and killing people indiscriminately in the camp, started doing that, and they were smiling to us. They opened all the doors. Inside the camp, they said we could go to different parts of the camp because brothers were sometimes separated. So we didn't know. My brother was with me, but sometimes, some brothers didn't know, if they were still alive or if they were dead by this point in time. It's another long story. Basically what happened, some journalists were coming to visit the camp, 3 British journalists, and inadvertently they saved my life, because had I stayed in this camp for another month, no one had to torture me. I'd either die from malnutrition or from dysentery, because dysentery was becoming rampant, such a basic illness, but if untreated, you die very quickly. I was then moved to another camp where I was kept for more than 4 months, but I knew they couldn't kill me in this other camp. So in the Omarska camp, I never knew for 2 minutes if they would kill me. And after that, this is how most of us look like after 2.5 months. So after that, after I was released from the second camp, I was taken to the UK by the Conservative government of John Major, 1993. And so that's the second part of my journey. So when I was in the camps, I just wanted to stay alive. I didn't ask myself, why is this happening? Some people couldn't accept their reality and they perished without being tortured. And when I arrived in the UK, there was an immigration official. He had a piece of paper, this piece of paper on his desk, and he asked me what my name was. And I said, Kemal Pervanić, so he wrote it down. And I didn't think of it in this way at the time, but this is how governments sometimes treat human beings. So after everything that I survived, I became a piece of paper. And I became a temporary refugee. The government invented a whole new status for people like myself. So I didn't become even a full refugee, and for me, refugee is one of the dirtiest words, not just in English language, but in every language. No one likes refugees. So once in the UK, with this piece of paper, I realized I had no identity, I had no roots, I was a stateless person. But I had a lot of trauma to compensate for all those other things that were missing. And like most survivors, I know that now, I decided not to talk about my experiences. No one offered any help. But I decided to use my time to do something useful, so I was trying to improve my English, even if the government chose to send me back after 6 months. It didn't make any sense because they would have to send me where I just came from. And at one point, I was no longer able to cope. I started crying. And I think I was not able to cry for at least 18 months. I was just not able to cry. But during this time, I had the luxury of blaming those who did those things to me, and I absolutely hated them. I absolutely hated them, and this is what the victims do. So blaming is the easiest thing in the world, and I didn't understand that. Victims don't understand that. And when I asked for help, there was a psychotherapist from Russia who offered her help, and I took her offer, and she turned me into a survivor. So this enabled me to start thinking in order to understand what happened. And then I was able to go back to Bosnia for the first time. And I spoke to my former teacher because I wanted to understand why not people like himself participated in this. He did say that those things happened, but he didn't want to take any responsibility. So basically, he said I was at the wrong time, at the wrong place, but ironically, he asked me to forgive him. I couldn't do it at this point in time because he wouldn't own up. But eventually, after torturing myself with this idea of forgiveness for a number of years, I did forgive them. And no one was present, and I realized I did the greatest favor to myself in this life, and some beautiful things started growing out of this. So going back, I realized that future generations of Bosnians were possibly going to experience something similar to my own fate if we didn't do something for them. So then I started a project with my ex-wife called Most Mira, Bridge of Peace, where we wanted to bring these young people together. And we experienced a lot of resistance. And eventually we were able to start working on this project, and we've been running it for the last 9 years. And it's just a small charity which has shown that if you give very little resources to ordinary Bosnian citizens, they will be able to build peace. But unfortunately, our politicians, so this is Milojica again, he told me, the guard and former schoolmate, he told me that even he sent his own children to take part in our project. And you see the guy wearing the green t-shirt, I've been working with him for years. He's my teacher's son. We have become good friends through this project. And politicians don't like our project because, you know, our politicians still remain in power by dividing people. So this is why I say nation builders don't like peace builders. But we've persisted, and we are in the process of building a peace center, which will be one of the rare spaces in Bosnia. I don't know of any other such spaces or places where young Bosnians will be able to come and hopefully create a shared future for all. So we are working with some experts from Austria, world-renowned experts, and they absolutely love the project. And we are right now in the process of raising funds so that we can build this center this year and next year. I'm sorry I took a little bit longer than I planned. Thank you very much for your patience. If you want to... I'm sorry I took time from another speaker. If you want to connect with me, I am on Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you, Kemal.